911, what's the emergency?
She said a dead person. He was laying on the floor. He was laying on the floor. Blood. Shot in the head.
I was very scared. I'm sure everybody in the neighborhood was scared.
The video was what broke the case.
Two individuals arriving at the back door that caught our attention.
You see the male individual bum rush or run towards whoever had opened the door.
Now they're murderers. Now the stakes are much more higher for them.
Why did it happen?
I don't know if we ever would have solved it without the CCTV.
Food's ready, come and get it!
71-year-old Jack Davis is busy preparing one of his famous roasts for his neighbors.
Main thing that he really loved to do was cook. And every Sunday, he would cook up a whole lot of meats.
Hi, Jack. Something smells good.
Nobody would go hungry because he always would give food. He loved doing stuff in the community with helping other people. He felt that the people in the neighborhood was family. Sometimes, especially in the summertime, you would see him coming and going in his RV. I know he loved having it and loved going out and coming back.
Jack recently sold his RV for $100,000. The cash lump sum will boost his finances as he slows down during his twilight years.
Here comes trouble.
It's cooking, Jack.
Jack, first of all, he was a school teacher, and then he was a bailiff at the courthouse, and he did part-time work at the hospital as a security guard.
Got any chicken left for me?
You know, our community is pretty much close-knit. On the most part, everybody in our neighborhood know each other by name. We associate a lot and everything together than just hanging out, laughing and carrying on. So he was like a big brother to me.
Special sleep.
Thank you.
That Sunday, we talked, just randomly talked for a few minutes, and I got the meats, and then I went on home.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Girl Scout Road. She said a dead person.
Okay, I can't, listen to me, I can't hear both of you at one time. Okay.
Shortly after 11 p.m. on July 19th, 2015, the 911 center received a phone call from Marcy Lynn Rouse requesting law enforcement. She had advised that her neighbor, Jack Davis Jr., had been shot.
She said she went to the house, and when she went in, he was laying on the floor. He was laying on the floor. Blood. Been shot in the head. It looked like he'd been shot in the head. It's okay.
In the background was the girlfriend of Jack Davis Jr., who also is the one who found Mr. Jack Davis when she arrived at his residence. And she was somewhat distraught and kind of screaming in the background.
Have a possible death report. The caller is advising that she's not exactly sure what happened.
It was initially thought it was either a suicide or a home invasion.
When officers arrive on the scene, they walk around to the back of the residence where there's an entrance to an enclosed garage area that had been turned into a den. They notice Jack lying in the floor, and there was blood pooled about his head. There was canes, a firearm, all sorts of things scattered around. At the time, they believed that he had shot himself with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the mouth or to the head.
They realized that the victim was still breathing, was still alive.
As Jack Davis is rushed to the hospital in critical condition, Detective Brock arrives on scene. to speak with the neighbor who called 911.
Marcy Rouse said that she had gone over sometime midday to Jack Davis's residence. I asked her about his state of mind.
We had a barbecue earlier today. Everything was fine. There was no problems. He was in good humor. There's nothing different.
I never thought suicide attempt because that's just not the person that I knew of Jack to be. And I was gone all day, but it was dark when I came home. I was in my bedroom in the back of my house. It sounded like a child screaming and crying. So I went to my front door, and it was this lady running across the street to my house. And it happened to be the girlfriend. And she was asking me, I'm sorry. She was asking me to call 911 because something had happened to Jack. And so that's when I called 911.
How is Jack? Is he gonna make it?
EMS are working on him right now.
I was very scared. I'm sure everybody in the street, on the neighborhood, was scared because we didn't know what had happened.
I don't know who would do this to Jack.
At 3 a.m., Marcy's son, Douglas, arrives on scene and notices that something is missing from Jack's property.
After I interviewed Marcy Rouse, her son arrived. He advised that Jack Davis's truck was no longer there. Talking to Marcy Rouse and her son, one of the things that they did say was the fact that nobody else should have the truck. One of the first questions is who has Mr. Jack Davis's truck and where is it at? We put a bolo or be on the lookout for Jack Davis's truck.
Detectives searched the house for the weapon that inflicted the wounds to Jack.
We checked the firearms on scene, and the firearm in question was a long rifle, a .22 caliber long rifle that has a tube that holds 10 bullets and also an initial bullet in the chamber. And all 11 bullets were inside of the firearm, and it was clean. You know, it had no evidence of blood or anything of that nature. So we pretty much casted out the doubt that, you know, that there was any self-inflicted gunshot wound, at least with that firearm. They go through the residence, and in some areas of the house, everything was tidy and neat. They would get to another room where everything had been dumped out of the drawers. The bed has been looked under.
The truck was missing. The residence appeared to be somewhat kind of ransacked. There was a possible struggle. At this point, we're appearing to change our position to maybe it was a home invasion like that may indicate something other than a suicide.
Detectives head outside to look for video surveillance cameras.
We come to find out Jack had a camera facing the back door where we had entered, and he also had a camera that pointed out toward the backyard that showed a shop in the backyard, the driveway where the pickup truck was supposed to have been parked.
We need to find the DVR for that.
Sure thing. These two angles that we had would show who had entered and who had left Mr. Jack Davis's residence. It also would show possibly who took the truck, when the last person was at the residence, what time the truck left. We observed that Jack Davis in the den area had a surveillance monitor. It showed the cameras on the exterior of the residence.
This is a live feed. Find out if the system recorded any footage from lunchtime onward.
On it. When I look over to the DVR, I see a light blinking that showed that it was actually recording.
The detectives take the surveillance footage to the police department for review.
We knew that the camera system, if it was working properly, would have valuable information as to who had been at the residence, some details of what had happened during the day.
Looks like it's working.
We started the footage from earlier that day. We knew that he had started cooking around lunchtime.
The cookout is over by 1:45 p.m., and the camera captures no activity around the back door for over 6 hours.
Throughout the day, with the cookout, there were people there. After they left, nobody came by.
It didn't seem to appear to be nothing out of the norm.
Detectives watched the footage up to 8:20 p.m.
It wasn't until later on that evening when we observed two individuals arriving at the back door that caught our attention. As we're looking at the camera video surveillance system, approximately 8:21 p.m., we observed a male and a female come around the corner of the residence.
Who are these guys?
They walk to the back door of Mr. Jack Davis' residence, and the male knocks on the door. The female stood behind the male, and then we could tell what we believed to be Jack Davis coming to the door and opening the door and answering the door. When we first saw that video, it appeared that he was a taller male, kind of bigger, stocky.
Zoom in on the female.
The female appeared to have maybe a ponytail.
Play that again?
You see the male individual bum rush or run towards whoever had opened the door, which is who we believe was Jack at the time. And then you see the female walk in shortly after and close the door.
We continue watching the video to see if they come out. Does Mr. Jack Davis come out with them? Does anybody else arrive?
Okay, who's this guy?
Approximately 8:24, the door appears to be open. At that point in time, we see an individual approach the door from the outside. The female opens the screen door, moves to the side, and lets a male come in the residence. Once the door shuts again, we see another male show up at the door, and he opens the door and goes in, and then the door shuts again.
So there's two more males entering the residence? Let's see that again.
What we could tell about the second male is he appeared to be wearing darker clothes. And the third male entered the residence, and he appeared to be wearing lighter colored clothes, but we could not see their faces at that point in time. It appeared that she knew they were coming because she opened the door for them. She knew who they were because she willingly let them in. The restricting part is the fact that we can't see what's going on inside the residence. Approximately 30 seconds to a minute later, the male with the light-colored clothes exited the residence in the same direction he had entered at a fast pace. We know something appears to be happening. There's more panic, and he leaves in a hurry, and nobody leaves with him.
Looks like he's desperate to get out of there.
approximately 8:27, we see the female exit the residence, and then the other two males. It appeared that the male in the dark clothes had something in his hand. It appeared to be some type of a box.
We're obviously thinking, all right, this has been a robbery. This is what has occurred. Now, what was their goal? What was the end goal? What did they steal? What was in that box?
And the male in the pattern clothes had some type of a item in his hand. We weren't sure at that point in time, but it appeared to be some type of a weapon.
Is that a shotgun?
We concluded that these more than likely the people that were involved with what happened to Mr. Jack Davis.
Jack Davis remains in critical condition. He is unable to answer the detective's questions about who attacked him.
At that point in time, the CCTV was the only lead that we had to go off as to identifying who these people were and to be able to speak with them and find out what their role in this crime was.
Where do they go when they leave the house? Run the footage from the second camera.
So we switched to the camera angle showing the backyard. We could see the Ford pickup truck in the backyard. The female goes to the vehicle and gets in the driver's side. Shortly thereafter, the two males come out. You could tell that the male in the pattern shirt was in the back bed of the truck. And they backed out of the driveway.
At daybreak, detectives hunt for more surveillance footage that could unlock the suspects' identities.
At 615 Girl Scout Road, we located a camera on the front side of the residence pointing out toward the roadway.
Hi, sir.
So we made contact with the resident there and eventually was able to obtain that video, which we brought to the station. As we were watching the video, they had sound too. We could see several vehicles go by. At one point, we saw a vehicle go by, and it appeared to go by a couple of times.
Play that again.
We could tell that the vehicle appeared to be some type of a sports car or possibly a red vehicle.
What make and model car is that?
What we see looks like a darker color Mustang.
Sounds like it's slowing down.
We could hear the vehicle slow down. Out of camera range, and also we could hear it speed back up again. As we continued to watch, shortly after that, we see a small vehicle approach from the Truman Avenue area, which is the road just down from Mr. Jack Davis' house.
Let's see that again.
The vehicle pulls in front of the residence. We could tell it was a little small SUV of some sort. After looking at the video, I concluded that it's possibly a RAV4. Couldn't tell the color of it, but it had a two-tone bottom to it. We saw that vehicle stop, and we heard the door shut. The vehicle drove off down Truven Avenue, and we continued to watch. And at that point, we saw the two males that had entered the house second after the male and the female. We saw them walking across the street toward Mr. Jack Davis' house.
Zoom in there.
We're trying to figure out who drives this RAV4 and who drives this Mustang, because they were both in the area at the time that the crime was committed. The morning of July 21st, which is just 2 days after this event's occurred, we received a call from a neighboring agency in another county, the Craven County Sheriff's Office. They called to report that they have found Mr. Davis's vehicle wrecked on the shoulder of the road and abandoned.
So I responded down to Riverside Road where the vehicle had been located. I made contact with the neighboring resident there. She was on scene, and she said that her son had noticed the vehicle there that Sunday night between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. And the vehicle had been sitting there since then.
And the significance is that at 11 o'clock on Sunday, I had gotten a call to respond to Jack Davis's house in regards to the incident itself. It was our understanding that the suspects had obviously driven this to an isolated, location and then ditched the vehicle in hopes of, getting away.
The crime lab responded. We noticed, first of all, that the vehicle's parked on the side of the road. It appeared to be partially in the ditch, and the driver's side window had been broken out of it. Once we got in the vehicle, we located Mr. Jack Davis's wallet, the box that appeared to be taken from the residence, and some miscellaneous items, but no money.
The black box is open, it's empty. So either they found what they were looking for, or maybe they're still looking. We don't know. The K-9 teams called in to conduct this track and this article search to search for articles left behind and search for our suspects. And the K-9s, they lead the officers down a dirt path, approximately 100 yards down that path, where the scent kind of dries up.
Kingston PD tows Jack's pickup to the police garage. Forensics officers process the vehicle.
Detectives start collecting samples from the inside. They're swabbing the steering wheel.
The CSI team finds no fingerprints and no usable DNA.
It's a bummer. It brings you down a little bit. It just puts a little bit more grit in us to keep on working harder until we solve this case.
Later that day, our investigators followed up with the hospital to check the status of Mr. Davis. We knew that he was in very serious condition, but we didn't know how serious. And that's when we were notified that Mr. Davis had passed away from his injuries.
The hospital that treated Jack calls Marcy Rouse.
Hello? I was hoping that he would pull through, but it was just shocking, it was saddened, it was hurtful to know that he had passed away. And for a good person like Jack was, nice as he was, to have to like to be taken away the way that it was taken. So it was tough.
It just felt like a bottomless pit in my bottom of my stomach, when I found out he had died.
So for the suspects, it goes from committing a robbery, a home invasion, and a violent assault to now they're murderers. Now the stakes are much more higher for them. It's a rapidly evolving case.
Hello?
Detective Brock speaking.
So about 4 hours after we're notified that Mr. Davis has been pronounced deceased at the hospital, we did receive a phone call from our 911 center who notified us that an anonymous tipster called and said that they may know who is involved in that particular murder, and they wanted an investigator to give them a call.
Copy that.
For this particular case, you know, we've got video, we've got the vehicle, we've got so much physical evidence, but we still don't have enough to charge anybody. We still need somebody to identify them, and now we're getting this call into the 911 center saying, we know who did it. We know the names. At that point, you know, the blood's pumping, adrenaline's going. It's time to solve this case.
This is Detective Brock. You have some information about the Jack Davis case?
And the next day, we were able to make contact with the caller. The caller advised that we needed to look into Phoenix Hannibal, as they were involved with the murder of Jack Davis. Phoenix Hannibal knew Jack Davis from the neighborhood. Jack Davis supposedly had quite a bit of money from the sale of an RV. People in the neighborhood felt like he had a lot of money from that sale. It appeared that multiple individuals apparently planned to enter the house to rob Jack, because it was known that he apparently had quite a bit of cash in the residence from the sale of that RV.
Detectives invite the female suspect, Phoenix Hannibal, to talk about Jack Davis's murder.
As we're standing there waiting for it to arrive, she arrives driving the Toyota RAV4 that's seen in the surveillance video in front of Mr. Davis's house. It was exciting to know that we had that piece of evidence right here. She brought it to us, but it also told us that she didn't believe we knew anything.
Investigators questioned Phoenix about her movements on the night of Jack's murder.
When we first get Phoenix Hannibal in the interview room, you can tell that she's not going to provide a lot of information.
Hey, and let me ask you this. Did you have any report in that conversation whatsoever?
I did not.
Once we brought the vehicle into it, then she began to change slightly. Then she would give us a little bit.
We got you on video driving. It's your car.
Yeah.
You don't find it strange, though, that you drove by the house?
All I know is that they asked me to give them a ride. He asked me to give his friends a ride. Trust me.
Why didn't you call us and tell us?
I don't know something.
I think you're trying to cover up something. I can look at your shirt, you're shaking.
Phoenix admitted to dropping two individuals off, but denied knowing anything about who they were or what their intentions were. She did not, at that time, give the names of the individuals involved. Later that afternoon, she was brought back in.
We don't have all day.
The Mexican boy named is Jonathan.
Jonathan who?
I don't know his last name. Y'all can't make me think of a last name. If I make up a last name and then y'all go to find him, and then it's a lie.
All right.
His name is Jonathan.
She gives us the name Jonathan, and she says that she doesn't know who they are. She's never met them before, and she's just giving them a ride.
She tells us that Jonathan and another unknown male rode with her.
At this point, one of the two males we still did not know the name of.
Through our investigative channels and different means of identifying people, we were able to identify that Jonathan was actually a young Hispanic male known as Jonathan Ordonez.
Jonathan Ordonez was the last person to get to the house, the first one to leave out of the house. We were able to corroborate that through her interview as well as through CCTV.
After Jonathan was arrested and brought down to the station to be interviewed, he really shined some light on this case. As we're talking to him, he admits to offering to help in this robbery. But at no point in time was this robbery supposed to turn into a murder.
Was he down when you went in? I don't know. You do? John. I know. I went in there, and I think they were holding him down. And when I went in the room, came back out, he was on the floor and they were hitting him.
This case is a particularly brutal crime to be committed. It's even more brutal when the people that you're arresting for this crime are in their late teens. You know, Jonathan was 16 years old at the time this was committed.
Investigators need to identify the second man in Phoenix's car. But first, they focus on who was driving the other vehicle.
The Mexican that was driving, his name was Adrian Lopez. Okay?
Yes, I believe you because I know Adrian.
I don't want to snitch, but I don't want to...
Snitching is covering your ass.
That's when she realizes it's in her best interest to cooperate. Throughout that cooperation, she tells us that the Mustang is associated also with Adrian Lopez.
She said Adrian Lopez was the one who dropped off the other two people that we saw on Mr. Jack Davis's cameras. And she actually gave the names.
It was Jaime there. It was a girl named Finney.
Adrian Lopez was actually the one that drove Jaime Torres and the female known as Finney to the house. She was adamant that she had no idea who Finney was.
I could write down the name, and you could check that out. And, like, you know what I'm saying? When that's it. The girl, she's a young girl. The only thing that I know about the girl, they call her Finney.
But eventually, it came out that Finney was Infinity Jones. And Phoenix was able to positively identify her as being the female that was in the video. So the puzzle had really come together at this point. We've been given all these names. We have Adrian Lopez, Jaime Torres, we have Infinity Jones, and we have Jonathan Ordonez. But we still have one that we don't know.
Investigators locate Jaime Torres and bring him to the police department for questioning.
Jack had taken Jaime under his wing, him and his brothers, and gave them odd jobs around the house.
Potentially, Jaime knew about the RV sale and the large sum of money that should have been there.
I was hoping to get the truth from him, being that he knew Jack personally. I interviewed Jaime Torres. He refused to give a statement. However, he did admit to being there at Jack Davis's during the crime, but says he don't remember anything about what had happened.
Jonathan Ordonez admits to knowing Jaime Torres, and he tells us he sees Jaime Torres attacking Jack Davis.
We saw Jaime, his physical description, his hair, everything looked similar to the video surveillance we had seen. So we knew that we could put him there as the person who entered the residence. Him admitting that he had been there during the crime, that gave us probable cause to arrest him for his role in that crime.
Next, investigators arrest Adrian Lopez, the driver of the Mustang that dropped off Jaime Torres and Infinity Jones.
We brought him down to the police department where we wanted to conduct an interview because we still had one piece of the puzzle that was missing. We didn't know who this other guy was that was seen on the surveillance video.
While she was distracted, he was supposed to be taking the stuff. I guess Johnny was coming in on it, just opening the door. And like I said, I ain't know the plan, just a little bit I did hear. And then they were like, nah, just take Jaime and Finney up there. And that was the last I heard of it. That was it.
During the interview with Adrian Lopez, he tells us that he's the one that had drove Jaime Torres and Infinity Jones, and through that association and his involvement with her, we're able to identify the last male as Johnny Sanders.
Hey, it's Goy. We have a name. Johnny Ray Sanders.
We know he's a dangerous individual, so we want to go ahead and locate him as soon as possible because we know that he's violent, and we don't want him to commit this on anybody.
Jaime Torres, Jonathan Ordonez, and Adrian Lopez. Now they need to trace the two remaining suspects, Infinity Jones and Johnny Ray Sanders.
Officers located Infinity Jones and brought her to the police department for an interview.
Who went with who? It was me, Jamie, and Adrian's car. Jamie just got up. Him and Jonathan flew to the back.
Through our interview with Infinity, she was able to make us aware that Johnny was the one that was mainly responsible for actually delivering the blows that would kill Mr. Jack Davis.
And Johnny was like, you don't speak, because I'm a female. You already knew I was going to tell. I'm scared. But, he was like, you don't see nothing. You know, this and that. And if any one of y'all snakes, I'll kill y'all.
Police intensify the hunt for Johnny and release his mugshot to the media.
We know that Johnny Sanders was the one that likely dealt the last blows to Mr. Davis that ended his life. We immediately start following up on leads, and within an hour or two of doing that, we get a phone call from Wilson County Sheriff's Office, and they tell us that Johnny has just walked in their front door to turn himself in.
Detective Brock.
I responded to Wilson Police Department with another officer.
I'll be right there.
To pick up Johnny Sanders. He told us that he had turned himself in after he had seen his picture on TV, that he was wanted for first-degree murder.
What's up, man?
He gives us a statement that he's never stepped foot in Jack Davis's house, but we know that to be a lie based on everything else we've discovered during this investigation.
Did you see him? Did you know anything about the guy?
No, I don't even know.
Murdered this Sunday?
I don't even know, dude. I seen his picture the same day I seen today when I seen my face on the news. I was like, nah, they ain't gonna
tell me. The guy that died?
Yeah.
You ain't know nothing about that? I don't know nothing about him.
Arresting Johnny Sanders, you know, it was, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of the puzzle because his role in the incident was the most violent.
News reaches Jack Davis's friends that police have arrested 6 people in connection with his murder.
That's something that you really can't put into words. When you see on the news that they've arrested several, people, you just want to know, why did it happen?
I felt like it was just totally senseless. These young people ruin their life over trying to steal a few measly dollars.
Phoenix Hannibal and Infinity Jones both plead guilty to second-degree murder. Adrian Lopez pleads guilty to robbery with a dangerous weapon. Jonathan Ordonez pleads guilty to first-degree burglary. These 4 receive sentences between 4 and 16.5 years. Johnny Sanders and Jaime Torres plead not guilty to first-degree murder. At their trials, prosecutors stepped through the events that led to Jack Davis's murder.
Jaime and Phoenix, they knew Jack Davis Jr. They were limited friends. They would go up there and visit him from time to time.
Thanks, my man.
They were aware that he sold an RV, for a good sizable amount of money. In their minds, there was a substantial amount of cash located in the house. On the evening that Jack was murdered, the plan took place for everyone to meet at Phoenix's residence. Phoenix was to drive Johnny and Jonathan. Adrian drove Nefinity and Jaime in his vehicle, so they took two separate vehicles to Jack's house, dropped everybody off.
Jaime Torres and Infinity Jones entered the house first. Jaime tackled Jack Davis. They started fighting. Mr. Jack Davis was getting the better of Jaime. Infinity picked up a police-style flashlight and hit Jack Davis with it. Jack took the flashlight. She opened the door for Johnny Sanders and Jonathan Ordonez to come into the residence. Johnny Sanders saw Jack Davis was getting the better of Jaime Torres. He started beating Jack Davis over the head with the short shotgun. At which point, Jack Davis stopped fighting. At that point, Jonathan Ordonez left out of the house. The other three remainders, Infinity Jones, Jaime Torres, Johnny Sanders, grabbed some items from the house and left the scene, leaving Jack Davis there to die, essentially. Once they left with Mr. Jack Davis's pickup truck, they drove to Craven County. Johnny Sanders parked the pickup truck on the side of the road, wiped it down, and then they went back to the residence where it was reported that they split the money in Jack Davis's wallet.
The whole reason for this orchestrated attempt to steal Mr. Davis's money he had just come into from the sale of his RV was all flawed, because after we conducted an investigation, it was determined that Jack Davis had actually placed his money in the bank where it would be safe and not in his home. And Mr. Davis was such a large pillar of the community, and he'd done so much to help the very people that killed him.
He was killed and murdered because he was a giving person and wanted to help people out.
As a result of the trial of Johnny Sanders and Jaime Torres, both were found guilty of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While we can't bring Jack Davis back, it was somewhat satisfying, the fact that we did solve the case and we were able to get justice for Jack Davis and Jack Davis's family.
The video in this case was what broke the case. Without the video, it would have been extremely difficult to piece this together, and I don't know if we ever would have solved it without the CCTV.
I don't think that Jack would want us to just continue to mope. We just have to pick up and just keep it going.
I miss Jack.
The cold wind howling off the Rocky Mountains in the dead of winter never managed to freeze the blood quite like the silence that settled over a small, unassuming suburban street in Denver back in 1993, a silence that began the exact moment a young woman vanished into thin air without leaving behind a single footprint in the freshly fallen snow. It was a normal Tuesday evening, the kind where television screens flickered through living room windows and the scent of wood smoke filled the crisp night air, yet beneath that veneer of American tranquility, a nightmare was being written in real time, a horror story that would remain open, bleeding, and entirely unexplained for over 3 decades. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing but the distant rumble of traffic from the interstate, no screams, no struggling, no screech of tires, just the sudden, absolute cessation of a life that had, until that very second, been filled with promise, leaving an entire community to look at one another with newfound suspicion as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into agonizing months. The police arrived with sirens muted, almost as if they already knew they were walking into a void, a sterile crime scene where the lack of evidence was itself a terrifying testament to a calculated, cold-blooded execution of a plan so perfect it defied the combined efforts of the city's finest investigators. For 33 years, that void remained a permanent fixture in the local consciousness, a haunting reminder that monsters do not always hide in the dark woods. Sometimes they live right next door, mowing their lawns, waving at your children, and carrying a secret so foul it rots the very foundation of the neighborhood. Generation after generation grew up under the shadow of this unsolved mystery, the name of the victim whispered like a ghost story around campfires, a cautionary tale used by terrified parents to keep their teenagers from walking home alone after dark, while the file in the police department grew yellow, dusty, and thick with the useless speculation of 100 different detectives who tried and failed to crack the case. It became the ultimate ghost in the machine of the Denver Police Department, the one that got away, a ledger entry that could never be balanced, leaving a family shattered and a city permanently scarred by the knowledge that a killer was walking among them, breathing the same mountain air, free. But the universe has a strange, violent way of correcting its own course when the living have given up all hope, and the true horror of this decades-old mystery was never meant to stay buried beneath the floorboards of time forever. It began not with a dramatic police raid or a sudden deathbed confession, but with the mundane, dusty reality of an estate sale, an old Victorian house on the edge of town being cleared out by distant relatives who never knew the dark history contained within its walls. Up in the suffocating heat of the attic, hidden beneath stacks of water-damaged newspapers from the early 90s and broken antique furniture, sat a single, unassuming leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and its pages brittle with age. When the heavy dust was brushed away, it revealed a meticulous, handwritten chronicle of madness, a terrifyingly detailed diary of surveillance, stalking, and ultimate execution that perfectly matched every missing detail of that fateful night in 1993. This was not a diary of teenage angst. It was a blueprint for murder, written with the cold, detached precision of a psychopath who viewed human life as nothing more than a puzzle to be solved and discarded. The handwriting, instantly recognizable to those who knew the home's former occupant, didn't just revive a dead investigation. It shattered 33 years of lies in a single afternoon, sending a shockwave through the community that made the original disappearance feel like it happened only yesterday. As the current detectives turned those fragile pages, they realized they weren't just looking at old notes. They were holding the smoking gun of a cold case that was about to blow wide open, proving that the past is never truly dead. It is just waiting for the right person to look in the attic. The immediate aftermath of the discovery was a frantic, high-stakes race against time as forensic experts worked in sterile labs to verify the authenticity of the notebook, their breath catching with every line of text that filled in the blanks of a tragedy that had baffled the city for a generation. The text was a harrowing journey into the mind of a predator, containing exact dates, times, clothing descriptions, and even maps drawn with disturbing accuracy, showing the exact route the victim took every day before she was snatched from existence. It became chillingly clear that this was a crime born of obsession, a calculated hunting expedition that took place right under the noses of an unsuspecting populace, proving that the killer had spent months, perhaps years, studying his prey from the shadows. The community, already on edge from decades of unanswered questions, watched in absolute fascination and horror as police cruisers suddenly swarmed a quiet, tree-lined street, sealing off a property that had long been considered a pillar of the local neighborhood. The realization that the monster had never fled the state, never gone into hiding, but had instead lived a full, respected life right there in Denver, just miles from where the crime occurred, sent a wave of revulsion through everyone who had ever crossed his path. It was a psychological car crash for the town, a moment where reality shifted and forced people to look back at 33 years of shared history through a lens of pure terror, wondering how many times they had smiled at a man who kept a logbook of death in his rafters. The investigation quickly shifted from a historical inquiry to an active, aggressive manhunt as tactical units moved in to secure the suspect, a man now fragile with age, but still possessing the cold, arrogant eyes described by those few who had briefly crossed his path decades ago. The arrest was swift, executed in the bright glare of afternoon sunlight, a stark contrast to the dark, secretive nature of the crime he had committed so long ago, leaving neighbors standing on their lawns in stunned, open-mouthed disbelief as the old man was led away in handcuffs. The local news channels broke into regular programming with flashing red banners, the words "Denver 1993 Cold Case Solved," searing themselves into the eyes of viewers who had long believed justice was a myth in this city. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, a battle of wits between seasoned detectives armed with the ultimate piece of evidence and an old man who had spent half his life believing he had committed the perfect crime. The notebook sat on the metal table between them like a ticking bomb, its presence alone stripping away the suspect's decades-old armor of denial until the weight of his own written words finally crushed his resistance. It was a masterclass in psychological collapse, watching a lifetime of arrogance unravel in a matter of hours as the realization set in that his own meticulous nature, the very trait that allowed him to escape capture for 33 years, was the exact thing that had sealed his fate. As the details of the confession began to leak out to a hungry, traumatized public, the true scope of the tragedy became agonizingly clear, painting a picture of a life stolen not by chance, but by a predatory malice that defied human comprehension. The victim's family, who had spent decades suspended in a hellish limbo of not knowing, received the news not with celebration, but with a profound, weeping exhaustion that spoke to the immense toll of carrying a 33-year-old grief. Every question they had ever cried out into the empty night was finally answered, but the answers brought no comfort, only the stark, ugly reality of how close the danger had always been, how easily a life can be snuffed out by a monster hiding behind a mask of normalcy. The city itself seemed to hold its collective breath as the legal machinery began to turn, realizing that while the mystery was solved, the healing process would take just as long as the silence that preceded it. The attic of that old house became a symbol of the dark corners that exist in every town, a reminder that the truth has a weight that cannot be permanently buried, no matter how much dirt or time or indifference you pile on top of it. The legal proceedings that followed were nothing short of a media circus, a grim parade of evidence that forced the public to confront the gruesome reality of what happened on that frozen night in 1993, stripping away any lingering doubts about the suspect's guilt. The courtroom was packed to capacity every single day, filled with people who wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had stolen their community's sense of safety, searching for some sign of remorse or humanity, but finding only a hollow, unrepentant shell. The prosecution laid out the case with devastating efficiency, using the notebook as a roadmap to guide the jury through the final hours of the victim's life, creating a narrative so vivid and terrifying that several people in the gallery had to flee the room in tears. It was a meticulous reconstruction of a nightmare, a forensic autopsy of a crime that had been frozen in time, now thawed out under the harsh, unforgiving lights of a courtroom. The defense tried desperately to argue that the notebook was a work of fiction, a twisted fantasy written by an eccentric man, but the sheer volume of corroborating physical details that only the killer could have known rendered their arguments utterly useless. Outside the courthouse, the streets were lined with citizens holding vigils, their candles flickering against the evening breeze just as the television screens had done 33 years prior, creating a bridge of light across 3 decades of darkness. The case became a national phenomenon, a textbook example of how modern forensic science and old-fashioned luck can collide to shatter the most perfect alibis, giving hope to thousands of other families who are still waiting for their own cold cases to be solved. Yet, beneath the national headlines and the sensationalized media coverage, the local heartbeat of Denver remained heavy, the collective consciousness deeply troubled by the realization of how easily a predator can blend into the fabric of daily life. People began checking their own attics, looking at their own neighbors with a new, cynical intensity, realizing that the thin line between safety and horror is often just a matter of a locked door or a chance encounter. The final verdict, when it came, was swift and unyielding, a declaration of maximum guilt that ensured the old man would spend the remaining days of his miserable life behind bars, but the victory felt hollow against the immense loss that could never be repaired. In the quiet months after the trial ended and the media trucks finally packed up and left the city, a strange, heavy peace settled over the neighborhood, a feeling that a long-standing debt had finally been paid, even if the currency was tragedy and grief. The house with the attic was eventually torn down, its wood and brick ground into dust and hauled away, an attempt by the community to erase the physical manifestation of the evil that had dwelt among them for so long. But you cannot erase a memory with a bulldozer, and the empty lot where the house once stood remained a scar on the street, a patch of barren earth where the grass refused to grow properly, as if the soil itself remembered the secrets it had harbored. The victim's family, now gray-haired and fragile, visited the site one last time to lay flowers, not for a missing person, but for a soul that had finally been brought home, their tears falling on the ground that had once held so much mystery. It was a closing of a chapter, but the book of Denver's history would forever carry the ink of that 1993 nightmare, a permanent reminder of the fragility of peace and the terrifying endurance of the truth. The legacy of the Denver cold case became a permanent fixture in the annals of criminal justice, studied by future generations of detectives as a reminder that no case is truly dead until the evidence is destroyed, inspiring a renewed vigor in police departments across the country to re-examine their own forgotten files. It proved that time is not an absolute shield for the guilty, that a conscience or a piece of paper can wait out a human lifespan just to strike at the exact moment the criminal thinks they are safe. For the people who lived through it, the case remains a conversational touchstone, a moment where everyone remembers exactly where they were when the news broke that the notebook had been found, a shared cultural trauma that defined a generation. The city moved on, as all cities must, new buildings rising where old ones fell, new families moving into the suburbs with no knowledge of the ghosts that preceded them, but the story remained, woven into the very air of the mile-high city. As the years continue to roll forward, pushing the events of 1993 further into the deep recesses of the past, the chilling lesson of the attic notebook remains as sharp and terrifying as it was the day it was uncovered. It stands as a warning to those who think they can outsmart justice, a declaration that the universe does not forget, even if it takes 33 years to speak. The silence that once characterized that Denver street is different now. It is no longer the suffocating silence of fear and suspicion, but the quiet, solemn peace of a community that fought its monster and won, even if the cost was a piece of its soul. And somewhere in the dark, quiet hours of the Denver night, when the wind blows hard off the mountains and the old houses creak, the memory of a young woman who was lost and finally found still lingers, a light that refused to be put out by the darkness of an attic. The final resting place of the victim is now marked not by an agonizing question mark, but by a stone that bears her name, a symbol of a narrative that was finally allowed to have a conclusion, no matter how tragic that conclusion might be. The detectives who poured their lives into the case have mostly retired, their hair white, their hands shaking, but their hearts finally lightened of the burden they carried for over half their lives. They look at the old leather notebook, now preserved in a police museum, not as a piece of horror, but as a monument to the inevitability of justice, a warning to every predator still hiding in the shadows that their day will come. The story of Denver's 1993 cold case is over. The ink has dried, the cell door is locked, and the city can finally sleep, knowing that the longest night in its history has finally met the dawn. The echo of that heavy steel cell door slamming shut on the man who thought he had outsmarted time itself should have been the final, definitive punctuation mark on the Denver 1993 cold case. But true horror rarely allows a community to heal that cleanly or that quickly. When a monster is unmasked after 33 years of living as a ghost in plain sight, the shockwaves do not simply dissipate. They fracture the very foundation of everyone who ever crossed his path, forcing an entire city to re-examine decades of ordinary, everyday memories through a lens of pure, retroactive terror. People began to look back at the block parties, the casual conversations over garden fences, the borrowed tools, and the polite nods shared at the neighborhood grocery store, realizing with a sickening shudder that they had been laughing and socializing with an apex predator who kept a detailed manual of slaughter hidden right above their heads. The realization didn't just break the peace of that quiet suburban street. It shattered the collective psyche of Denver, triggering a wave of profound paranoia that spread like a contagion through the suburbs and into the heart of the city itself. Neighbors who had known the suspect for decades found themselves staring at their own family members, their own friends, and the strangers they passed on the street, suddenly consumed by the agonizing question of who else among them was harboring a secret foul enough to rot the earth beneath their feet. The police department's phone lines, which had gone quiet in the immediate aftermath of the arrest, suddenly exploded with a torrent of frantic calls from citizens demanding that old missing persons reports, unsolved break-ins, and strange encounters from the 90s be reopened, convinced that the Attic Notebook was only the first chapter in a much larger, much darker anthology of blood. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms of the Denver Police Department's cold case homicide unit, the atmosphere was a chaotic mix of exhausted triumph and escalating dread as the investigative team realized that their work, far from being finished, was actually just beginning. The leather-bound notebook that had sealed the old man's fate was no longer just a piece of evidence. It had become an archaeological artifact of pure malice, and every single page had to be subjected to intense, microscopic scrutiny to ensure that no hidden details or secondary victims had been overlooked. Teams of forensic linguists, behavioral analysts, and handwriting experts were brought in from across the country, turning the small office into a war room where the air smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the distinct, metallic tang of fear. They analyzed the syntax, the cadence of the handwriting, and the specific types of ink used in the entries, trying to map out the exact progression of the killer's psychological descent from an obsessed stalker into a calculated executioner. What they found within those brittle pages was a level of meticulous premeditation that defied everything they thought they knew about human depravity, a timeline so precise that it mapped perfectly onto the city's infrastructure changes, weather patterns, and public transit schedules from 1993. The killer hadn't just watched his victim. He had documented her life with the cold, detached clinical precision of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope, noting down the exact variance in her arrival times, the color of her winter coats, and even the moments when she looked vulnerable or distracted. The public's appetite for information was insatiable, driven by a morbid fascination that the local media was all too eager to feed with sensationalist headlines and nightly specials that dissected every aspect of the 1993 disappearance. True crime podcasters, independent journalists, and television crews from national networks descended upon Denver like vultures, setting up their tripods and satellite dishes outside the precinct and the now infamous house with the attic, transforming a quiet residential neighborhood into a chaotic, brightly lit circus of tragedy. They interviewed anyone who had ever stood within 5 feet of the suspect, dragging up old high school yearbooks, workplace performance reviews, and long-forgotten neighborhood disputes to piece together a portrait of a man who had successfully worn a mask of absolute normalcy for his entire adult life. For the family of the victim, this sudden onslaught of media attention was a secondary violation, a cruel mechanism that forced them to relive the worst moment of their lives under the unblinking, judgmental glare of millions of strangers. They had spent 33 years praying for an answer, but they had never anticipated that the answer would come wrapped in the cheap, lurid packaging of a primetime television special, turning their private, agonizing grief into a commodity to be bought, sold, and analyzed during commercial breaks. As the forensic teams dug deeper into the physical structure of the Victorian house itself, the nightmare expanded beyond the pages of the notebook and into the very bones of the building, turning the property into a horrific crime scene all over again. Behind the drywall, beneath the floorboards of the living room, and hidden deep within the crawl spaces of the basement, investigators began uncovering a chilling collection of trophies, small, seemingly mundane items that had belonged to the victim and, terrifyingly, several other unidentified individuals. A silver charm bracelet, a single leather glove, a faded library card, and a collection of keys that didn't fit any lock in the house were carefully bagged and tagged by technicians dressed in white hazmat suits, their faces pale under their plastic visors. Each item represented a potential life stolen or disrupted, a silent testament to a career of predatory behavior that likely stretched far beyond the single 1993 homicide that had brought the killer down. The local coroner's office became a revolving door of specialized consultants as they worked to cross-reference these newly discovered tokens with a vast database of unsolved cold cases from across the entire Rocky Mountain region, realizing that they might be looking at one of the most prolific, undetected serial predators in the history of the state. The defense team representing the old man attempted to launch a desperate counteroffensive, filing a barrage of legal motions to suppress the notebook and the trophies, arguing that the search of the attic had been conducted without a proper warrant and that the evidence was fruit of a poisonous tree. They portrayed their client as a frail, demented old man who was being railroaded by a desperate police department eager to close an embarrassing historical file, claiming that the notebook was nothing more than the dark, fictional musings of a troubled youth that had no bearing on reality. But the prosecution, backed by an overwhelming mountain of corroborating evidence and a public that was screaming for blood, held their ground with an ironclad resolve that refused to be shaken by legal technicalities. They brought forward the estate executors who had discovered the notebook, establishing a pristine, unbroken chain of custody that proved the evidence had been found entirely by chance during a private clean-out, bypassing the constitutional restrictions that would have applied to a law enforcement search. The judge, a seasoned jurist who had seen the worst of humanity over a long career, denied the defense's motions one by one, ensuring that the trial would proceed and that the contents of the attic notebook would be laid bare before a jury of the suspect's peers. The tension in the city reached a boiling point on the morning the trial officially commenced, with hundreds of people lining up outside the courthouse in the freezing rain before dawn just to secure a seat in the public gallery. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was heavy, suffocating, and charged with an electric current of collective anger as the suspect was wheeled into the room, looking smaller, more fragile, and far less formidable than he had in the old photographs from 1993. Yet, when he raised his eyes to look at the gallery, there was no fear in his gaze, no remorse, only a cold, defiant arrogance that seemed to say he had already won by escaping justice for more than half his natural life. The prosecution began their opening statement not with a dry recitation of dates and legal statutes, but by painting a devastatingly vivid picture of that snow-covered Denver street 33 years ago, transporting the jury back to the exact moment when a young woman's future was violently erased by the old man sitting just feet away from them. They described the trajectory of a bullet, the coldness of the earth, and the long, agonizing silence that followed, weaving a narrative that was so raw, so immediate, that the passage of 3 decades seemed to vanish entirely from the room. When the primary detective who had spent the last 5 years of his career obsessed with a case took the stand, he didn't just present the facts, he delivered a masterclass in forensic persistence, demonstrating how modern science had finally caught up with a 1993 crime. He walked the jury through the complex process of genetic genealogy, explaining how microscopic traces of DNA found on the binding of the notebook had been used to construct a family tree that pointed directly and exclusively to the suspect. The courtroom was dead silent as the detective read aloud from the notebook itself, his voice steady but laced with a deep, controlled disgust as he recited the killer's own words describing the final, terrifying moments of the victim's life. The words were a window into hell, an explicit, unvarnished account of absolute cruelty that left several jurors visibly shaking, their eyes darting between the evidence on the projector screen and the impassive face of the man who had written it. It was the moment the trial shifted from a legal proceeding into a moral reckoning, a public exorcism of a demon that had haunted Denver for 33 years, and everyone in the room knew there was no coming back from what they were hearing. The defense's cross-examination was a desperate, aggressive attempt to poke holes in the forensic timeline, suggesting that the DNA could have been contaminated or that the notebook had been planted by someone with a grudge against the family. They grilled the forensic experts for hours, demanding statistical probabilities, questioning lab protocols, and trying to confuse the jury with dense, technical jargon. But the scientific evidence was too robust, too definitive to be undermined by rhetorical parlor tricks. Every attempt to minimize the horror only seemed to make the prosecution's case stronger, highlighting the stark contrast between the defense's cold legal maneuvering and the undeniable, heartbreaking reality of a stolen life. The victim's mother, now an elderly woman confined to a wheelchair, sat in the front row of the gallery every single day, her eyes fixed on the suspect with a quiet, fierce dignity that spoke louder than any argument the lawyers could make. She had outlived her husband, her health was failing, but she had refused to die until she saw the man who had destroyed her family brought to account, her presence a constant, living reminder of the human cost of the crime. As the trial entered its final days, the focus shifted from the guilt of the suspect, which was now an established certainty in the minds of everyone watching, to the systemic failures that had allowed him to remain free for over 3 decades. Questions began to surface about the original 1993 investigation, about the leads that had been dropped, the witnesses who had been ignored, and the critical errors that had allowed a monster to slip through the dragnet while the trail was still warm. Investigative journalists uncovered old police logs showing that the suspect had actually been interviewed briefly during the initial canvass of the neighborhood, but had been dismissed as a viable lead simply because he was polite, employed, and didn't fit the profile of a violent predator. This revelation sent a fresh wave of fury through the community, exposing the terrifying truth that the safety of their families had been compromised not by a lack of evidence, but by the biases and incompetence of the very people sworn to protect them. The police department was forced to issue a public apology, a bitter, hollow gesture that did nothing to ease the anger of a city that had spent 33 years looking over its shoulder in fear. The closing arguments were a battle of emotional extremes, with the defense pleading for mercy for an old man facing the end of his life, while the prosecution demanded absolute, unyielding justice for a victim who had never been given a chance to grow old. The prosecutor stood before the jury box, holding the leather notebook in one hand and a photograph of the victim in the other, asking them to choose between the manufactured pity of a courtroom and the eternal debt owed to the dead. The jury's deliberation was surprisingly brief, lasting only a few agonizing hours before the announcement came that a verdict had been reached, drawing a massive crowd back to the courthouse for the final act of this decades-long drama. When the foreperson read the word guilty on every single count, a collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a profound, weeping relief that seemed to lift a heavy, invisible weight off the shoulders of the entire city. The suspect showed no reaction, his face remaining a blank, stony mask as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again see the light of day outside the concrete walls of a maximum security penitentiary. But as the old man was led away to begin his sentence, the city of Denver discovered that a verdict does not bring closure. It only changes the nature of the pain. The empty lot where the Victorian house had stood became a makeshift memorial, covered in candles, flowers, and handwritten notes from citizens who wanted to honor the victim and ensure that her name would never be forgotten again. The notebook itself was locked away in a high-security vault at the police archives, a dark relic of a time when terror walked the streets of Denver unchecked, its pages closed but its lessons forever etched into the consciousness of the community. The people who lived through those 33 years of silence would never truly be the same, their innocence lost to the knowledge that the world is a far darker, more unpredictable place than they had ever cared to admit. And as the winter wind continues to howl off the Rocky Mountains, rattling the windows of the quiet suburban homes, it carries with it the enduring echo of a cold case that was finally solved, a reminder that the truth will always find a way out of the attic, no matter how long the darkness tries to keep it hidden. The closure of the courtroom doors and the finality of a life sentence behind maximum security bars should have allowed the city of Denver to finally turn the page on the 1993 nightmare, but the dark reality of a 33-year-old cold case is that the truth rarely stops bleeding just because a judge signs a piece of paper. The conviction of the frail, arrogant old man was supposed to be the end of the narrative, a definitive triumph of modern forensics over historical malice, Yet the moment the high-profile trial concluded, a new and far more insidious chapter began to unfold in the underbelly of the city. As investigative journalists and independent researchers began digging through the thousands of pages of unredacted court documents, public records, and the newly released transcripts of the suspect's jailhouse interrogations, a terrifying realization began to dawn on the public. The Attic Notebook was not an isolated manifestation of madness, but the midpoint of a lifelong career of undetected terror. The meticulous nature of the 1993 stalking logs suggested a level of sophisticated criminal expertise that no one could possess on their very first attempt, meaning that before he ever focused his deadly obsession on that quiet suburban street, the killer had likely practiced his twisted craft on countless others who were still classified as runaways, missing persons, or victims of unsolved accidents. The local police department, instead of celebrating a closed file, found themselves staring at a massive, sprawling labyrinth of historical data that threatened to connect their newly convicted prisoner to a string of unresolved disappearances stretching across multiple states and through nearly 4 decades of American history. The focus of the entire Pacific Northwest and Rocky Mountain law enforcement community abruptly shifted to the timeline of the suspect's early life, a transient journey through college towns, construction sites, and seasonal logging camps during the late 1970s and 1980s. Every city he had ever lived in, every apartment he had ever rented, and every company car he had ever driven became a potential coordinate on a map of uncharted tragedies, turning the Denver cold case into the epicenter of a massive, multi-jurisdictional task force. Detectives from Wyoming, Utah, Montana, and Idaho began arriving at the Denver precinct with boxes of their own yellowed files, looking to cross-reference the handwriting, the methods, and the specific geographic details found in the killer's attic archives with their own local ghosts. The atmosphere within the task force headquarters was suffocatingly grim, a space where the walls were covered in black and white photographs of young faces whose fates had remained a mystery for a generation, all of them now cast under the shadow of the same elderly monster. It was a forensic post-mortem of a lifetime spent in the shadows, a realization that the safety the region thought it enjoyed during those decades was entirely an illusion, maintained only because one man was clever enough to keep his journals hidden beneath the insulation of a dusty rafters. Meanwhile, inside the maximum security facility where the killer was slated to spend the remainder of his natural life, a psychological game of cat and mouse was being played out between the aging convict and a select group of FBI behavioral analysts who refused to let him take his remaining secrets to the grave. The old man, stripped of his fine clothes, his neighborhood respectability, and his freedom, now used his hidden knowledge as his final piece of currency, a weapon to manipulate the system and torment the families who were still desperate for answers. He would drop cryptic hints during interviews, mentioning specific landmarks, weather conditions, or clothing items from decades-old cases, only to fall completely silent the moment investigators pressed for exact locations or names. He took in twisted, obvious pleasure in watching the desperate frustration of the detectives sitting across the metal table from him, proving that even behind bars, handcuffed and broken by age, he still possessed the same predatory desire to control, terrorize, and dominate the lives of others. The transcripts of these prison interviews painted a portrait of a psychological black hole, a mind that viewed human beings not as living creatures with souls, but as pieces on a chessboard that he had successfully manipulated for over half his life. Out in the communities where the suspect had once lived, the revelation of his potential connection to other crimes triggered a secondary wave of cultural trauma, forcing people to confront the terrifying reality of who they had allowed into their lives. In the small mountain towns outside Denver, where the killer used to spend his weekends fishing and hiking, locals began to re-examine old accidents, strange disappearances from campgrounds, and rumors of a mountain stalker that had circulated during the mid-90s. The casual, polite interactions that people remembered having with him on hiking trails or at local diners took on a retroactively sickening quality, leaving an entire generation of outdoorsmen and residents to wonder how close they had come to becoming a footnote in his leather-bound journal. The local economy of these tourist towns, built on the promise of pristine nature and rustic safety, suffered a quiet, profound blow as the realization set in that the wilderness had for years served as a dumping ground for an undetected monster who used the vast, rugged terrain of the Rockies to conceal his work. The media circus that had surrounded the initial trial did not fade. Instead, it evolved into a permanent, investigative industry, with documentary crews and true crime networks producing multi-part series that analyzed every single frame of the suspect's life. They tracked down his childhood friends, his former coworkers, and the women he had dated briefly in his youth, trying to find the exact moment when the trajectory of his life shifted into pure malice. What they discovered was far more unsettling than a dramatic childhood trauma or a sudden mental break. They found a life of terrifying, unremarkable mediocrity, a man who had been completely invisible precisely because he was so utterly ordinary. He wasn't a criminal mastermind with an eccentric lifestyle. He was a guy who paid his taxes on time, kept his lawn immaculate, and never raised his voice in public, proving the horrifying thesis that the most dangerous predators are those who blend seamlessly into the background noise of everyday society. This realization became the true lasting horror of the Denver case, a cultural paradigm shift that made people realize that the traditional warning signs of evil were completely useless against a monster who chose to wear a mask of perfect middle-class stability. As the multi-state task force continued to digitize and analyze the entries from the notebook using advanced artificial intelligence and pattern recognition software, they began to decode a series of alphanumeric sequences that had initially been dismissed as random scribbles or grocery lists. These codes, when mapped against historical geological survey data and old regional highway maps, revealed themselves to be highly precise coordinates pointing to remote, long-abandoned locations across the high desert of Wyoming and the dense forests of northern Colorado. The investigation shifted from the sterile rooms of the crime lab to the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the American West, as teams of forensic anthropologists, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar technicians were deployed to search the coordinates hidden within the text. The public watched with bated breath as live news feeds showed law enforcement vehicles convoys snaking their way into isolated canyons and ghost towns, the search for the dead turning into a massive archaeological excavation of a killer's secret history. Each site held the potential to either shatter a family's decades-long limbo or plunge the region into an even deeper state of collective mourning, a high-stakes gamble against time and the elements that kept the entire country transfixed. The first major breakthrough came in a remote, windswept valley just across the Wyoming border, where ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly deep beneath the soil of a collapsed 1970s mining cabin that the suspect had frequented during his youth. As the excavation team carefully removed layers of dry, packed earth, they uncovered the skeletal remains of a young individual whose description matched an unsolved missing person case from 1981, an individual who had vanished after leaving a truck stop just 20 miles from the site. The discovery sent a physical shockwave through the law enforcement community, providing the definitive, undeniable proof that the Denver 1993 case was merely the tip of an iceberg that stretched back into the darkest corners of the previous century. The victim's family, who had spent 45 years wondering if their loved one had simply run away to start a new life, was delivered a devastating, definitive finality that was both a relief and a horrific validation of their worst fears. The narrative of the polite Denver neighbor was officially dead, replaced by the terrifying reality of an interstate serial predator who had used the vast emptiness of the American West to bury his sins for nearly half a century. Back in Denver, the victim's family from the 1993 case watched these new developments with a complex, heavy mix of emotions, realizing that their daughter's tragedy had become the key that unlocked a treasury of historical horrors. They found themselves thrust into an informal network of grief, connecting with families from other states who were just now receiving the news that their own cold cases were linked to the man in the Denver prison. These families, separated by decades and hundreds of miles, were bound together by a shared history of unanswered questions and the mutual trauma inflicted by a single, calculating individual who had stolen their futures. The solidarity among the victims' families became a powerful, driving force in the ongoing investigation, preventing the state authorities from quietly winding down the task force due to budgetary constraints or political fatigue. They organized press conferences, funded independent search efforts, and kept the memory of the dead alive in the public square, ensuring that the killer would be forced to confront the full scale of his crimes before his own time ran out. The legal implications of the new discoveries created a massive jurisdictional nightmare as prosecutors from multiple states began jockeying for the opportunity to put the old man on trial within their own borders, seeking justice for their own forgotten citizens. The defense team, meanwhile, argued that their client was physically and mentally unfit to withstand another lengthy trial, claiming that the onset of age-related dementia had rendered him incapable of assisting in his own defense or understanding the charges against him. This legal maneuvering triggered a fierce, public debate over the ethics of prosecuting an elderly, ailing convict who was already guaranteed to die in prison, with some arguing that the cost to taxpayers was unjustified, while others insisted that every single victim deserved their day in court, regardless of the suspect's health. The controversy exposed the deep, unresolved tensions within the American justice system regarding the balance between retribution, closure, and the pragmatic realities of managing historical crimes that take decades to solve. Inside the prison hospital ward where the suspect was now being held under constant medical supervision, the old man's physical decline began to accelerate, his body finally giving way to the natural processes that he had violently denied so many others. Detectives raced against the biological clock, conducting daily interviews at his bedside, trying to extract final confessions or descriptions of where other victims might be buried before the curtain came down on his consciousness forever. The atmosphere in those final sessions was an intense, claustrophobic drama, a desperate attempt to salvage historical truth from a dying mind that still fought to retain its secrets out of pure, spiteful malice. The killer would smile weakly through his oxygen mask, nodding along to the descriptions of old crimes, playing the role of the enigmatic oracle until the very end, refusing to grant the final satisfaction of absolute clarity to the people he had spent a lifetime destroying. It was a stark, chilling reminder that some monsters do not experience a deathbed reformation. They remain committed to their cruelty until their very last breath, viewing their silence as their final, eternal victory over the living. When the news finally broke that the suspect had died in his hospital bed from natural causes, the reaction across Denver and the wider Rocky Mountain region was not one of grief, but of a profound, collective exhaustion that felt like the lowering of a heavy shroud. The man who had haunted the city's consciousness for 33 years was gone, taking with him the full extent of his secrets and leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions that would likely never be resolved. The task force was eventually disbanded, its files boxed up and archived, and the police museum where the attic notebook was kept became a quiet place of study for future forensic scientists who wanted to understand how a predator could remain undetected for so long. The story of Denver's 1993 cold case didn't end with a neat, cinematic resolution. It dissolved into a collection of fragments, a historical puzzle with missing pieces that would forever remind the city of the fragility of peace and the terrifying endurance of human malice. And yet, in the quiet suburbs where the nightmare began, the silence that now exists is no longer a hiding place for a monster. It is a space where the living can finally remember the dead without fear, their names spoken aloud under the wide, open canopy of the Colorado sky. The physical death of the Denver predator in his prison hospital bed did not act as the grand equalizer or the clean resolution the public had so desperately craved. Instead, it froze the sprawling investigation in a state of permanent, agonizing suspension. When a serial killer dies with unmapped secrets still locked inside the decaying architecture of his mind, he commits his final acts of violence against the living by leaving them stranded in a labyrinth with no exit. Across the Rocky Mountain region, the multi-agency task force that had been working with such feverish momentum was suddenly forced to halt its active interrogations, leaving hundreds of open leads dangling into a void where no further confessions could ever be extracted. The legal machinery that had been preparing secondary indictments in Wyoming and Utah ground to an abrupt, unceremonious standstill, as a dead man cannot be prosecuted, leaving the families of suspected victims with the hollow realization that they would never see the monster stand before a jury for what he did to their children. The quiet fury that settled over the law enforcement community was palpable, A bitter sense of defeat wrapped in a technical victory, because while the 1993 Denver case had been decisively closed by the Attic Notebook, the wider ledger of the killer's lifetime remained terrifyingly unbalanced, an unwritten history written in the blood of the forgotten. Back at the Denver Police Department, the cold case unit felt less like a place of triumph and more like an archival graveyard where the ghosts of 40 years were refusing to rest. The digital systems that had been processing the alphanumeric codes from the leather notebook continued to spit out potential geographic coordinates across the West, but without the suspect alive to confirm or deny the significance of these remote locations, each data point became a costly, high-stakes gamble for local sheriff's departments. Search and recovery teams found themselves staring at vast expanses of rugged mountain terrain, dense forests, and desolate high-desert plains, knowing that a single set of coordinates could point to a shallow grave hidden beneath 40 years of pine needles or to absolutely nothing at all. A cruel wild goose chase orchestrated from beyond the grave by a dead man's meticulous nature. Budgetary constraints quickly began to rear their ugly heads as county commissioners questioned the utility of spending tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars to excavate remote wilderness sites based on the ambiguous journal entries of a deceased convict, creating a tense, painful friction between pragmatic bureaucrats and the relentless detectives who refused to let the investigation die with the suspect. The local and national media outlets, recognizing that the immediate drama of the courtroom and the prison ward had expired, shifted their narrative focus toward the cultural and psychological wreckage left behind in the wake of the revelation. Investigative journalists began producing retrospective pieces that looked at how the killer's ability to remain undetected for 33 years reflected a deeper, systemic vulnerability within the structure of modern suburban life. Television specials featured panels of criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists who dissected the concept of the sociopathic mask, using the Denver case as the definitive modern case study of how the illusion of neighborly safety can be weaponized by a predator. They analyzed how the rapid growth of Denver suburbs in the early 1990s, characterized by transient populations, master-planned communities where neighbors rarely knew each other's backgrounds, and a collective desire to look outward toward prosperity rather than inward toward danger, had created the perfect ecological niche for a monster to thrive. This wasn't just a story about a killer anymore. It had transformed into a mirror that forced the entire community to look at the superficiality of their own social connections, realizing that the ultimate horror was not the complexity of the crime, but the simplicity with which it had been hidden in plain sight. For the immediate neighbors who still lived on that quiet, tree-lined Denver street where the suspect's Victorian house had once stood, the death of the old man brought no relief from the invisible shroud that had settled over their property values and their daily lives. The empty lot where the house had been demolished remained an unsettling, barren gap in the residential smile of the block, an architectural scar that kept the memory of the 1993 disappearance raw and immediate for everyone who walked past it. Children playing in the neighborhood were instinctively steered away from the perimeter of the property by their parents, as if the soil itself were contaminated by the residual essence of the malice that had been recorded in the attic for over 3 decades. The older residents, those who had lived on the street since the 90s and had shared casual conversations with the killer, found themselves trapped in a state of permanent psychological discomfort, unable to shake the intrusive memories of the man who had mowed his lawn with a smile while keeping a diary of death just 15 feet above his pillow. The block had become a monument to a collective failure of intuition, a place where the ordinary rhythms of suburban life had been permanently disrupted by the intrusion of an unimaginable truth. As the physical searches in the surrounding states began to slow down due to the onset of another brutal Colorado winter, a grassroots movement arose from the victims' families and concerned citizens who refused to let the momentum of the case be buried by time or bureaucracy. They formed an independent, nonprofit coalition dedicated to funding private forensic searches, maintaining a centralized database of missing persons from the era of the killer's active timeline, and lobbying state legislatures for the creation of permanent, well-funded cold case registries. This coalition transformed their shared, devastating grief into an organized, political force, ensuring that the names of the suspected victims remained in the public eye even after the news trucks had moved on to the next sensationalized national tragedy. They held annual vigils at the empty Denver lot, transforming the site of the horror into a sanctuary of remembrance, where the flickering light of hundreds of candles served as a silent, defiant protest against the institutional forgetfulness that so often swallows historical crimes. Inside the archives of the Denver Police Department, the physical notebook that had started it all was subjected to one final, exhaustive forensic process, a non-destructive chemical analysis of the paper, the binding, and the microscopic dust particles trapped between the pages, conducted by a specialized team from the Smithsonian Institution. This high-tech autopsy of an object revealed that the notebook had been purchased in a small stationery shop in San Francisco in the late 1970s, providing a new, definitive starting point for the suspect's criminal trajectory that investigators had previously only guessed at. The analysis also discovered faint, overlapping indentations on the blank back pages of the journal, impressions left behind by the pressure of a pen from sheets of paper that had been torn out long before the notebook was hidden in the attic. Using advanced multispectral imaging and oblique lighting techniques, forensic technicians were able to reconstruct several fragments of these obliterated texts, revealing names, dates, and partial license plate numbers from the late 1980s that did not correspond to any known victim in the Colorado databases. The revelation that the killer had actively censored his own journal, destroying evidence of certain crimes while meticulously preserving others, sent a chill through the investigative team, suggesting that the notebook found in the attic was not a complete record, but a curated exhibition of the crimes he was most proud of, or perhaps the ones he felt most secure in keeping. This discovery ignited a frantic, quiet effort to trace the newly uncovered license plates and names through the legacy paper records of the California and Nevada Departments of Motor Vehicles, dragging the investigation back out of the Rocky Mountains and toward the West Coast. It became clear that the Denver cold case was merely the third act of a tragic play that had begun decades earlier in the fog-heavy streets of Northern California, shifting the historical narrative of the suspect from a local Colorado predator into a sweeping, cross-country nomad of violence. The sheer scale of the historical puzzle began to overwhelm the resources of the local Denver detectives, who were forced to hand over large portions of their findings to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, where the data could be integrated into a national matrix designed to catch links between unsolved homicides across state lines. The case had outgrown the city that birthed its resolution, becoming a national emblem of the long, dark shadow cast by the unmonitored movement of predators during the pre-digital era of American law enforcement. The psychological toll on the original detectives who had cracked the case using the attic notebook began to manifest in deep, quiet ways as they reached their mandatory retirement ages, their careers ending not with the clean satisfaction of a completed mission, but with the heavy, lingering burden of what remained undiscovered. The primary investigator, the man who had stood on the witness stand and read the killer's words to a weeping courtroom, spent his final days on the force organizing his personal files, creating a massive, digitized encyclopedia of the suspect's life that he intended to pass on to the next generation of homicide investigators. He would often sit alone in the dark office long after his shift had ended, staring at the multispectral images of the torn-out pages, his mind locked in an endless, frustrating dialogue with a dead man who had beaten him to the grave. For these law enforcement veterans, the Denver cold case was an obsession that could not be turned off with a retirement party or a commemorative plaque. It was a permanent scar on their souls, a reminder that for all the advancements in DNA technology and forensic science, the human capacity for deception will always be one step ahead of the tools designed to catch it. As the years began to push the 1993 disappearance further into the realm of historical true crime lore, the story of the attic notebook achieved a mythic, cautionary status within the city of Denver, taught to new police recruits as a textbook example of why an investigator must never allow a file to be truly forgotten. The leather journal itself was eventually moved from the active evidence locker to a secure display case within the department's historical museum, sitting under bulletproof glass like a captured piece of unexploded ordnance from a forgotten war, a silent, terrifying testament to the evil that can exist behind the most ordinary facade. Visitors to the museum, Mostly young officers and criminal justice students would stand before the fragile, yellowed pages, reading the meticulous handwriting with a sense of detached awe, struggling to comprehend how a single object could hold the power to destroy a family, shatter a community, and rewrite 33 years of a city's history in a single afternoon. The ultimate legacy of the Denver 1993 cold case was not found in the headlines, the political debates, or the forensic breakthroughs, but in the quiet, profound shift in the way the people of the city raised their children and secured their homes. The old, innocent assumption that a locked door and a friendly neighbor were enough to guarantee safety had been permanently dismantled, replaced by a modern, vigilant realism that understood that danger does not always wear a monstrous face or shout from the shadows. The memory of the young woman who had vanished into the mountain air on that frozen Tuesday evening became a permanent part of the city's identity, her name a symbol of a collective promise that no matter how much time passes, no matter how deep the snow falls, and no matter how dark the attic where the truth is hidden, the living will never stop searching for the dead. And as the dark Colorado night falls over the suburbs and the wind from the Rockies rattles the rafters of 1,000 homes, the city sleeps with one eye open, forever changed by the knowledge of what was found beneath the floorboards of time. The transition of the Denver 1993 cold case from an active, breaking news story into a dark cornerstone of regional folklore did nothing to dull the sharp edges of its psychological aftermath. Instead, it allowed the trauma to seep deeper into the institutional memory of Colorado law enforcement. By the time the mid-20s rolled around, the high-tech forensic breakthroughs that had unmasked the elderly predator had become standard operating procedures, yet the specialized digital archive known internally as the Attic Notebook Ledger remained a highly classified, heavily studied anomaly within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's behavioral science systems. The death of the killer had effectively closed his lips, but the lingering ghost of his meticulous nature continued to challenge the brightest minds in criminology, who refused to accept that a leather journal containing 3 decades of unadulterated madness could ever be fully drained of its secrets. Every year, on the exact anniversary of that frozen Tuesday evening when the young woman vanished into the mountain air, a new generation of analysts was assigned to the file, tasked with staring at the multispectral images of the torn-out pages, searching for the subtle, microscopic tells that their predecessors had missed in the initial rush of the courtroom drama. It was a recognition that while the physical body of the monster had been successfully returned to the earth in an unmarked prison grave, the conceptual architecture of his crimes remained fully intact, a blueprint of middle-class sociopathy that continued to threaten the collective security of unsuspecting suburbs across the nation. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled vault of the Denver Police Department where the physical artifacts of the 1993 case were permanently stored, the atmosphere remained heavy with the silent weight of 33 years of institutional frustration. The leather notebook sat inside its vacuum-sealed, ultraviolet filtering container, its cracked spine and brittle, tea-colored pages looking entirely too fragile to have ever held the power to destroy an entire community's sense of reality. To the casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than a discarded piece of antique junk, the kind of forgotten diary one might find at a flea market for a handful of dollars, but to the veteran detectives who occasionally visited the vault, it was a holy relic of pure malice, a physical manifestation of a human conscience that had completely decoupled from the concept of empathy. The handwriting, executed in the tight, uniform cursive style taught in mid-century American schools, was so chillingly neat that it looked as if it had been generated by an early printing press rather than the hand of a man who spent his nights stalking human beings through the snow. This eerie juxtaposition between the orderly presentation and the chaotic, blood-drenched reality of the content was what made the notebook a subject of permanent fascination for psychological profilers, who used it to dismantle the outdated myth that violent predators are inherently disorganized, erratic, or easily spotted by their social deviations. The cultural ripple effects of the case continued to manifest in the real estate market of the Denver metropolitan area, where the concept of stigmatized properties took on a terrifyingly specific meaning in the wake of the attic discovery. Homebuyers who had previously focused entirely on school districts, square footage, and property taxes began demanding comprehensive historical background checks on residential structures, explicitly asking real estate agents whether any former occupants had been linked to unsolved cold cases or long-term historical investigations. The revelation that a respected, quiet pillar of the local neighborhood could maintain a secret vault of death in his rafters for over 3 decades without raising a single red flag among his peers completely undermined the superficial trust upon which the suburban economy was built. People no longer viewed a well-manicured lawn or a friendly wave from across the driveway as a guarantee of safety. They saw them as potential camouflage, a highly effective camouflage designed to deflect suspicion and protect a lifetime of predatory behavior. Home inspection companies quickly adapted to this new wave of consumer anxiety, offering specialized attic and crawlspace forensic assessments that use thermal imaging and deep scanning radar to ensure that no hidden compartments, false walls, or forgotten journals were lurking beneath the insulation of newly purchased homes. For the surviving members of the 1993 victim's family, the passage of time since the trial had not brought the pristine, cinematic closure promised by the media, but rather a slow, grinding adjustment to a life where their private tragedy was permanently woven into the public history of the city. The mother, who had survived just long enough to see the word guilty pronounced in the packed courtroom, passed away quietly in her sleep less than a year after the verdict, her final months defined by a profound, hollow exhaustion that left her looking like a survivor of a long, devastating siege. The remaining siblings found themselves in a surreal position of being living extensions of a famous historical event, their family name forever linked to the headline that had shocked the nation: Denver 1993 cold case solved. Notebook found in attic seals suspect's fate. They actively resisted the constant overtures from Hollywood producers and sensationalist true crime authors who wanted to turn their decades of agony into a glossy, multi-part streaming series, choosing instead to channel their energies into supporting the independent, nonprofit coalition they had helped establish during the height of the investigation. They understood that the true monument to their sister's memory was not a dramatic television adaptation or a best-selling book, but the quiet, relentless work of ensuring that other families trapped in the limbo of an unsolved disappearance were never abandoned by the system. Meanwhile, the data-sharing network established by the multi-state task force before the killer's death began to bear fruit in unexpected, quiet ways across the Pacific Northwest, proving that the digital legacy of the Attic Notebook was far more powerful than the silence of the man who wrote it. In a small timber town in northern Idaho, a retired sheriff's deputy who had spent 40 years obsessing over the 1979 disappearance of a young hitchhiker happened to read a specialized law enforcement bulletin detailing the newly decoded alphanumeric strings from the Denver file. The deputy recognized that the specific geographic coordinates and the cryptic references to the Logging Line Road matched an old timber trail that had been abandoned in the early 80s, a trail that passed within 3 miles of the suspect's known employment records from that era. This breakthrough reignited a long-dormant investigation, prompting the local sheriff's department to secure funding for a targeted excavation of the site using the same advanced ground-penetrating radar techniques that had been perfected during the searches in Wyoming. The effort was a testament to the fact that while a serial predator can use his life to create a chain of destruction, the modern integration of law enforcement data can turn his own meticulous records into a map that eventually leads to his complete and total undoing, even decades after his heart has stopped beating. The search in Idaho, conducted under the gray, heavy skies of an early winter morning, was watched with intense interest by the global criminological community, who realized that the Denver Notebook was effectively serving as a Rosetta Stone for unsolved historical homicides across the entire western half of the United States. As the heavy machinery carefully peeled back 40 years of compacted forest floor and rotted cedar logs, the radar equipment detected the distinct outline of a structural disturbance deep within the clay soil, an anomaly that perfectly mirrored the shallow burial methods described in the early sections of the killer's journal. When the forensic anthropologists carefully brushed away the wet earth, they uncovered a small collection of personal effects, a tarnished silver watch, a pair of vintage eyeglasses, and a brass belt buckle that were immediately identified as belonging to the missing 1979 victim. The discovery didn't just close another cold case file. It sent a wave of validation through the entire network of detectives who had refused to let the Denver Predator's secrets die with him, proving that the ledger could still be balanced, one name at a time, through sheer, unyielding persistence. Back in Denver, the empty residential lot where the killer's house had once stood remained an unyielding anomaly on the suburban street, a physical void that refused to be integrated back into the normal rhythms of the neighborhood. A local conservation trust, working in partnership with the victim's family, eventually purchased the land with the explicit purpose of preventing it from ever being developed into another residential property, ensuring that no future family would ever unwittingly sleep over the ground that had harbored such immense darkness. The lot was transformed into a minimalist reflection garden, a space defined not by statues or dramatic monuments, but by native Colorado wildflowers, low stone benches, and a single, understated bronze plaque that bore only the name of the 1993 victim and the dates of her life. It became a quiet sanctuary for the neighborhood, a place where people could walk their dogs, sit with a book in the afternoon sun, or quietly reflect on the fragile nature of the peace they so often took for granted. The transformation of the site from a monument of horror into a space of quiet beauty was the community's ultimate act of defiance against the legacy of the predator, a declaration that the final word on that street would belong to remembrance and peace, not to the calculated madness of the attic notebook. As the legal and forensic records of the case were systematically organized and prepared for permanent inclusion in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the primary detective who had led the charge to open the attic vault spent his final days before retirement sitting in his empty office, looking out over the Denver skyline as the sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. His desk, which had for years been buried beneath mountains of crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and legal motions, was now completely clear, save for a single, framed photograph of the 1993 victim taken just weeks before she was taken from the world. He had spent the best years of his life chasing a ghost, sacrificing his own peace of mind, his relationships, and his health to solve a mystery that many within his own department had dismissed as an unwinnable waste of time. He knew better than anyone that the victory he had achieved was a fractured one, that for every secret they had dragged out into the light of the courtroom, there were likely a dozen more that would remain forever buried in the vast, silent expanses of the American West. But as he turned off the lights and locked the door to his office for the final time, he carried within the quiet, unbreakable satisfaction of a man who had looked into the eyes of a monster, called him by his true name, and forced him to answer for the crime that had frozen a city's heart for 33 years. The lasting significance of the Denver 1993 cold case ultimately settled into the academic textbooks of criminal justice programs worldwide, where it was dissected not as a sensational piece of true crime entertainment, but as a watershed moment in the evolution of modern law enforcement strategy. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that the traditional boundaries between active investigations and historical archives were completely artificial, and that a department's willingness to re-examine its own failures with humility and technological ambition could yield results that defied the limitations of time. The story of the notebook found in the attic became a literal parable taught to young recruits at police academies from Los Angeles to New York, an enduring reminder that the key to solving the most baffling mysteries of the present is often waiting for them in the forgotten dust of the past, if only they have the courage to look up into the rafters. And as the modern city of Denver continues to grow, its glass towers reflecting the bright Colorado sun and its streets filled with the vibrant energy of a new generation, the quiet memory of the frozen night that changed everything remains a permanent, grounding frequency in the city's heart. A reminder that justice is not a myth, that the dead are never truly forgotten, and that the truth has an undeniable, terrifying weight that will eventually crush any lock, any floorboard, and any lie, designed to keep it hidden from the light. The entry of the Idaho discovery into the master database didn't just add another line to the killer's historical profile. It fundamentally dismantled the psychological framework that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had used to categorize mid-century American predators for decades. For generations, the behavioral sciences had operated on a rigid dichotomy. Killers were either organized, calculating individuals who maintained pristine social camouflage but confined their activities to a tight geographic radius, or they were disorganized, chaotic nomads whose constant wandering was driven by an inability to fit into society. The Denver Predator, as revealed by the ongoing cross-referencing of his attic notebook, was a terrifying mutation that defied both classifications. A flawless suburban chameleon who possessed the stability to maintain a single residence and a respected career for over 33 years, while simultaneously operating as a ghost-like interstate nomad whenever he stepped outside the state lines. The realization that a man could walk into a hardware store in Denver, purchase a lawnmower, chat with his neighbors about the upcoming football season, and then calmly drive across a state border to execute a meticulously planned hunting expedition from his youth sent a shudder through the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. It meant that the existing profiling filters used to flag potential suspects in historical homicides were fundamentally blind to this specific breed of calculated, dual-existence malice, forcing a complete overhaul of how cold case files were audited across the country. Within the high-security digital workspace of the violent criminal apprehension networks, this new hybrid profile became known as the static nomad, and the Denver 1993 case was elevated to the definitive instructional model for every major police academy in North America. The leather notebook, though physically resting under glass in Colorado, was transformed into a multidimensional digital matrix, its text broken down into thousands of behavioral nodes that were fed into the advanced pattern recognition algorithms of the decade. Analysts weren't just looking at the words anymore. They were studying the microscopic intervals between the entries, the psychological pacing of the handwriting, and the specific emotional triggers that caused the killer to transition from passive surveillance to active physical intervention. They discovered that his periods of intense suburban conformity, the years where he was recorded as a model neighbor, attending community meetings and volunteering for local cleanups, corresponded precisely with the aftermath of his most violent out-of-state excursions, revealing that his mask of middle-class normalcy wasn't just a shield to hide from the police. It was a psychological stabilizer, a deliberate, manufactured anchor that he used to ground his mind after immersing himself in the chaos of his crimes. This profound psychological insight triggered a radical shift in how local detectives in Denver viewed the long-term residents of their own communities, introducing a subtle, systemic cynicism into the fabric of neighborhood policing. The old-school assumption that a clean background check, a steady job, and an open garage door were indicative of a low-risk profile was replaced by a sophisticated understanding of behavioral compartmentalization, leaving officers to wonder how many other immaculate lawns were masking an attic full of historical horrors. In the suburban developments that ringed the mile-high city, where thousands of nearly identical houses stood in perfect, master-planned symmetry, the story of the 1993 cold case became a permanent cultural reference point, a dark myth that changed the very architecture of domestic trust. People who had spent their entire lives leaving their back doors unlocked and allowing their children to play in the streets until the streetlights came on began investing heavily in advanced home security infrastructure, turning their private residences into fortified sanctuaries. The fear was no longer driven by the threat of an external, recognizable criminal element invading their space from the inner city. It was driven by the terrifying realization that the ultimate threat was already inside the perimeter, sitting on the deck next door, sipping a beer, and watching your family through a pair of perfectly ordinary binoculars. The independent coalition founded by the victims' families, now operating with a substantial endowment from private donors who had been moved by the case, expanded its operations into a national forensic advocacy group, effectively bypassing the slow, bureaucratic channels of state-funded law enforcement. They purchased their own fleet of mobile ground-penetrating radar units, contracted retired high-profile forensic anthropologists, and established a specialized digital clearinghouse where families from across the country could upload vintage photographs, old police reports, and personal timelines from the 1970s and 80s. This citizen-led investigative machine became a relentless force in the true crime landscape, refusing to let the institutional fatigue of local police departments bury the remaining secrets of the Denver Predators timeline. They understood that with every year that passed, the physical evidence hidden in the remote corners of the West was degrading, the old structures were collapsing, and the terrain was shifting due to climate changes and urban sprawl, making their mission an urgent, desperate race against the natural eraser of time. They didn't just want closures on paper. They wanted to strip the killer of every single victory he had achieved through his silence, systematically reclaiming the lost histories of the individuals he had tried to reduce to mere footnotes in his leather-bound ledger. The pressure from this national advocacy group forced the state of Colorado to establish a permanent, fully independent grand jury specifically tasked with reviewing the corporate and financial records of the deceased suspect's entire adult life, a massive financial autopsy designed to track his movements through his spending habits. Investigators from the State Revenue Service and forensic accountants from the FBI spent months digitizing thousands of pages of vintage bank statements, old credit card slips, gas receipts, and hotel ledgers that had been recovered from the basement of the demolished Victorian house. This financial archaeology revealed a highly structured pattern of cash withdrawals and out-of-state credit transactions that corresponded perfectly with the dates of dozens of unsolved missing persons reports from the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest. The killer had left behind a secondary, economic footprint that was just as precise as his handwritten journal, a paper trail of fuel purchases, highway tolls, and hardware store receipts that mapped out his predatory itineraries with devastating clarity. Every time he had crossed a state line, every time he had stayed in a budget motel on the edge of a highway, and every time he had purchased specific tools or materials, the financial system had quietly recorded the transaction, creating an unalterable ledger of intent that the suspect could never have anticipated would be read 30 years later. One specific string of transactions from August 1987 drew the intense scrutiny of the Financial Task Force, pointing to a series of fuel stops along Route 66 through New Mexico and Arizona, a region where the suspect had never officially held employment or owned property. When this timeline was cross-referenced with a national database of unsolved historical homicides, it aligned perfectly with the disappearance of 2 college students who had vanished while on a cross-country road trip, a case that had remained one of the Southwest's most baffling mysteries for nearly 40 years. The discovery that the Denver Predator's reach had extended all the way into the sun-baked expanses of the desert Southwest shattered the regional boundaries of the investigation once again, proving that his leather notebook was merely a localized manifestation of a much larger, cross-continental web of violence. The local sheriff's departments in Arizona and New Mexico were immediately brought into the task force, their old paper files pulled from the dusty basements of desert courthouses and fed into the central digital system in Denver, as the entire country watched the true, monstrous dimensions of the old man's life continue to expand long after his death. The physical reality of this cross-country connection became concrete when a team of desert search specialists, guided by the financial coordinates and the specific geographic descriptions found in a secondary, fragmented section of the notebook's digital reconstruction, deployed to an isolated arroyo outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. The search conditions were the polar opposite of the frozen Denver streets or the damp forests of Idaho. Here, the team worked under a blinding, merciless desert sun, their boots kicking up clouds of fine, red dust as they moved their radar equipment over the cracked, parched earth. The desert, like the mountains, has its own unique way of preserving and hiding secrets, its dry heat capable of mummifying organic material or baking evidence into an iron-like consistency that resists the passage of decades. After 3 days of systematic sweeping, the ground-penetrating radar flagged a distinct subsurface anomaly located beneath the roots of an ancient, twisted juniper tree, a tree that had stood as a silent witness to the changing landscape of the desert since the mid-20s. As the archaeologists carefully removed the dry, stone-heavy soil, the desert finally surrendered its portion of the truth, revealing the metallic remains of a vintage 1980s travel trunk that contained the undeniable, tragic answers to the 1987 Southwestern mystery. The confirmation of the Southwestern victims sent an overwhelming wave of shock through the true crime community and law enforcement agencies nationwide, solidifying the Denver 1993 cold case as the catalyst for one of the most significant historical forensic operations in the history of American criminology. The narrative had completely outgrown the concept of a singular solved crime. It had become an ongoing national reckoning with a ghost, a systematic dismantling of a legacy of absolute evil that had thought itself entirely safe behind the barrier of time and human mortality. In Denver, the local media coverage took on a somber, quasi-religious tone, with nightly broadcasts tracking the progress of the searches like a long, painful march toward national collective healing. The anchor of that original headline, "The Notebook Found in the Attic," remained the central pivot of every discussion, an enduring symbol of how a single, ordinary object, when touched by the hand of persistent justice, can possess the explosive power to rewrite the history of an entire nation's hidden tragedies. Back on the quiet suburban street in Denver, the reflection garden that had replaced the killer's house stood as a peaceful, green counterweight to the escalating horror of the national investigations, its simple existence a testament to the community's refusal to let the darkness dominate their environment. The native wildflowers had taken root in the soil, their bright blooms shifting with the summer breeze, creating a space that felt entirely disconnected from the cold, clinical world of forensic labs and police archives. Neighbors who had once avoided the lot now gathered there in the evenings, sitting on the stone benches and talking quietly while their children played on the grass, reclaiming the space for the ordinary, beautiful rhythms of everyday life. They had learned the hard way that you cannot erase the past, that you cannot scrub the memory of a monster out of the history of a street, but you can choose what you build on top of the ruins. You can choose to build a space of remembrance, a space of peace, and a space where the names of the lost are carried with honor and love into the future. As the digital reconstruction of the Notebook's torn-out pages neared its absolute completion, the advanced imaging technicians at the federal labs uncovered one final, faint indentation on the very last layer of the leather binding, a signature, written not in the killer's tight, uniform cursive, but in a loose, irregular hand that matched no known sample in his file. This final, cryptic clue suggested a possibility that sent a cold shock through the remaining members of the task force. The killer might not have worked entirely alone during the early stages of his career, or perhaps someone else had discovered his notebook long before the estate executors found it in the attic, someone who had chosen to remain silent, leaving the monster free to continue his work for 33 years. The implication was a terrifying reminder that the closing of a single file is rarely the end of the mystery, that the dark corners of human history are deep, complex, and filled with overlapping shadows that resist the simple, clean narrative of a solved case. But as the technicians prepared to feed this new signature into the national database, they did so with the quiet, unbreakable confidence of a system that had already proven that no secret is safe from the light, and that no matter how long the darkness holds its breath, the truth will eventually find its way out of the attic. Binding didn't just open a new investigative avenue. It fractured the entire foundational assumption of the Denver 1993 cold case, morphing what had been a decades-long hunt for a solitary monster into a chilling inquiry into institutional or familial complicity. For 33 years, the city of Denver had comforted itself with the narrative of a singular, anomalous predator, a lone wolf who had managed to slip through the cracks of society through sheer, terrifying luck and a uniquely compartmentalized mind. But a second handwriting style, a faint imprint left behind by a ballpoint pen on the structural marrow of the journal, suggested a reality far more destabilizing, that the killer had an audience, an accomplice, or a witness who had held the smoking gun of the 1993 disappearance in their hands and chosen to say absolutely nothing. The task force, which had been preparing to archive the sprawling cross-country findings, was instantly plunged back into a state of high-intensity panic, realizing that while the primary author of the notebook was dead and buried, the individual who signed that binding might still be walking the streets of Denver, breathing the same air, and harboring the same ancient, unpunished secrets. The forensic linguistics and handwriting analysis teams at the federal laboratories in Virginia immediately went to work on the newly revealed impression, utilizing advanced 3D laser scanning typography to isolate the individual strokes of the pen and separate them from the textures of the aged leather. The strokes revealed a loose, sweeping style with a distinct left-handed slant, characterized by heavy pressure on the downward movements, suggesting an individual who is either writing in a state of intense emotional agitation or deliberately trying to alter their natural penmanship. This signature was not an entry in the diary. It was a mark of ownership or a silent message left behind within the physical anatomy of the book, a cryptic seal that had remained entirely invisible to the naked eye until the Smithsonian team peeled back the microscopic layers of dirt and degradation. The realization that someone else had handled the notebook, likely while it was still hidden in the suffocating heat of that Victorian attic, transformed the old house from a static crime scene into a dynamic hub of historical deception, forcing detectives to look closely at every single person who had ever held a key to that front door over the last 3 decades. The financial and property records of the Victorian estate were instantly subjected to a microscopic, historic audit, with investigators tracing the chain of title, tenancy agreements, and maintenance contracts back to the mid-1980s to identify every individual who had ever had legitimate access to the upper levels of the structure. They discovered that during the late 90s, while the initial investigation into the young woman's disappearance was grinding to a miserable, icy halt, the suspect had briefly rented out the lower apartment of the house to a rotating cast of local college students, construction laborers, and distant relatives who were passing through the Denver metropolitan area. Each of these names had to be systematically retrieved from vintage paper tax ledgers, old city directories, and forgotten utility bills, creating a massive, sprawling family tree of potential suspects that stretched across the entire country. The quiet suburban street, which had barely begun to recover from the media circus of the trial and the subsequent demolition of the house, found itself once again under the heavy, scrutinizing gaze of plainclothes detectives who were quietly knocking on doors, asking questions about people who had lived on the block 30 years ago. The psychological weight of this new development settled heavily over the National Forensic Advocacy Group founded by the victims' families, who had to absorb the agonizing possibility that the systemic failure to save their loved ones extended far beyond the incompetence of the original 1993 police department. The idea that a second individual possessed the knowledge to stop the predator, to bring an end to the multi-state campaign of violence, and to deliver answers to the grieving families decades earlier, but chose instead to remain silent out of self-preservation or shared malice, was a profound, unbearable realization. It stripped away the comforting illusion that justice was a simple matter of tracking down a single bad actor. It exposed a deeper, structural rot within the human condition, a capacity for passive cruelty that was just as terrifying as the active violence recorded within the pages of the Attic Notebook. The coalition channeled this collective revulsion into a renewed public campaign, offering a massive, privately funded reward for any information leading to the identification of the left-handed writer, transforming the local Denver cold case into a high-stakes, international crowdsourced investigation. Inside the data war room at the Denver precinct, the primary investigative team began cross-referencing the physical characteristics of the left-handed script with the thousands of letters, tips, and citizen complaints that had been mailed to the police department during the initial 1993 investigation. During the pre-digital era of law enforcement, cold cases were often buried beneath mountains of anonymous, handwritten notes from well-meaning citizens, attention seekers, and occasionally, the killers themselves, who used the postal service to taunt the authorities or redirect the trajectory of the investigation. As the team systematically digitized and analyzed these vintage archives using modern handwriting recognition software, the computer systems flagged a striking, terrifying match between the Attic signature and an anonymous letter that had been mailed to the lead homicide detective in November 1994, exactly 1 year after the victim's disappearance. The letter, postmarked from a small town on the western slope of the Colorado Rockies, contained no text, only a crude, hand-drawn map of the Denver suburban street with a dark, heavy cross marked directly over the attic window of the suspect's house. The discovery of the 1994 letter sent a physical shockwave through the cold case unit, providing the definitive, undeniable proof that someone had tried to point the police toward the Attic Notebook while the trail was still warm, but the clue had been dismissed, misfiled, or ignored by an overburdened, blind investigative team. The map was a desperate, silent whistleblower's cry from the past, a visual confession that someone knew exactly where the blueprint for murder was hidden, but lacked the courage to walk into a police station and state their name aloud. The realization that the entire 33-year nightmare could have been prevented, that dozens of subsequent victims across Idaho, Wyoming, and Arizona could have been saved if only someone had looked up into that rafters in 1994, was a crushing, devastating blow to the institutional pride of the Denver Police Department. It laid bare the tragic reality that the ultimate enemy of justice is not always the brilliance of the criminal, but the bureaucratic blindness and administrative inertia of the system designed to catch them. The focus of the active manhunt instantly shifted to the small, isolated mountain town from which the 1994 letter had been postmarked, a historic mining community nestled deep within a rugged canyon 200 miles west of Denver. Tactical units and specialized cold case investigators descended upon the town, setting up a temporary command post in a local municipal building and beginning the grueling process of auditing the historical residents who had lived in the area during the mid-90s. The town, characterized by its transient winter population of skiers and its tight-knit, insular community of lifelong locals, viewed the sudden influx of federal and state law enforcement with a mix of hostility and intense, guarded curiosity. Detectives spent weeks interviewing elderly postal workers, retired town clerks, and local shopkeepers, showing them digital reconstructions of the left-handed signature and the 1994 map, searching for any memory of a resident who had a personal or professional connection to the quiet Denver neighbor with the dark attic. As the financial archaeology team dug deeper into the deceased suspect's personal banking records from that specific 1994 timeline, they uncovered a series of regular, monthly checks made out to a private medical facility located on the outskirts of that exact same mountain community. The facility, which had specialized in long-term psychiatric care and rehabilitation during the 1990s, had closed its doors permanently in the early 2000s, its patient records transferred to a secure state archive or lost entirely during the corporate liquidation of the parent company. The checks, signed by the killer with his typical, neat cursive, were marked with a cryptic notation in the memo line, family maintenance, despite the fact that all public records indicated the suspect was an only child whose parents had passed away long before his move to Denver. This hidden financial pipeline suggested the existence of a secret family dynamic, a brother, a cousin, or perhaps an illegitimate child whose existence had been systematically erased from the public record, maintained only as a hidden line item in the killer's private accounting ledger. The effort to retrieve the lost patient records from the defunct psychiatric facility became a frantic, legal battle against time and administrative decay, with state prosecutors utilizing emergency court orders to force the release of archived corporate microfilms from the state capitol's deepest storage vaults. When the dusty, long-forgotten reels were finally mounted on the readers in Denver, investigators found themselves looking at a medical history that read like a psychological companion piece to the attic notebook itself. The records revealed that in the winter of 1993, just weeks after the young woman vanished from that frozen suburban street, a young man with a history of severe behavioral disturbances and a documented relationship to the suspect had been admitted to the facility under an assumed name, his expenses paid entirely in cash and personal checks by the Denver neighbor. Most chillingly, the medical intake file noted that the patient was heavily left-handed, possessed a history of obsessive, geometric drawing, and had been admitted in a state of acute, catatonic terror, repeatedly screaming about the things hidden in the rafters. The revelation that the killer's own close relative had been a traumatized, silent witness to the immediate aftermath of the 1993 crime and had likely discovered the leather notebook before being quietly locked away in a mountain asylum to protect the family secret shattered the final remnants of the case's original framework. The left-handed signature in the binding was not the mark of a malicious co-conspirator, but the desperate, terrified act of a secondary victim, a young man who had tried to leave a permanent mark of truth within the belly of the beast before his voice was permanently silenced by institutional confinement and family pressure. The task force worked with frantic energy to trace the current status of this hidden relative, discovering that after the closure of the psychiatric facility, he had been transferred through a series of anonymous state-run group homes, eventually settling into a quiet, assisted living facility on the edge of the Denver metro area, just miles from where the nightmare had originally begun. The final act of this psychological drama took place in the quiet, sterile sunroom of the assisted living facility, where seasoned behavioral analysts and a soft-spoken detective from the cold case unit sat down with an old, gray-haired man whose hands shook with the tremors of a lifetime of heavy medication. They didn't bring handcuffs or legal notices. They brought a copy of the 1994 map, a photograph of the young woman who had disappeared in 1993, and the original leather notebook, preserved inside its clear, protective casing. The moment the old man's eyes locked onto the cracked spine of the journal, a profound, visible transformation swept over his fragile frame, the fog of decades of institutionalization parting to reveal a raw, immediate terror that had remained frozen in his mind since his youth. He reached out with a trembling left hand, his fingers tracing the shape of the binding through the plastic shield, his voice breaking the long silence of the room with a single, weeping sentence that brought 33 years of historical deception to a definitive, heartbreaking end. He told me the house would eat me if I told anyone what was up there. The old man's fragmented, emotional testimony provided the final, missing pieces of the Denver 1993 cold case, filling in the horrific details of the nights spent listening to the footsteps in the attic, the discovery of the journal, and the systematic psychological terror used by the killer to ensure his absolute silence. The 1994 letter and map had been his one desperate attempt to invoke the protection of the law, a cry for help that had been lost in the administrative machinery of a city that was too busy looking at the surface of the crime to look up into the rafters. While the revelation brought no new convictions, as the killer was dead and the relative was an innocent, terrorized victim of modern psychological abuse, it delivered a profound, solemn sense of historical clarity to a city that had been haunted by the unknown for a generation. The story of the notebook found in the attic was finally complete, its text decoded, its signatures identified, and its secrets fully laid bare before the world, leaving Denver to finally heal from the knowledge of the monster who had lived among them and the silent, broken witness who had spent a